But this morning we continue in Genesis, and we are in Genesis, the 25th chapter. And it begins, "Now Abraham took another wife, whose name was Keturah." Now 1 Chronicles 1:32 describes Keturah as a concubine. And indeed, later on in this chapter, you're going to see this same lady mentioned in context with concubines, or in that context. So that tells me that Moses uses those terms, wife and concubine, interchangeably in context, of course, determining the meaning. But he takes to himself Keturah. And verse 2 says that she bore to him Zimram and Jokshan and Medan and Midian and Ishbak and Shua. You say, where do they get these names? Don't ask. Just go with it, okay? And notice that it says Midian. This is where the Midianites come from. As you see these descendants listed by Moses, you immediately see the connection that Moses is making to the people to whom he is writing, that is, the Israelites that are in the wilderness wanderings. He is telling them, as well as successive generations of Israelites, everyone that we're dealing with here in Canaan comes straight from all of this. In other words, all of us are related back to Abraham, which is exactly what the Lord had promised all the way back in Genesis 12. Verse 3 then says, Jokshan became the father of Sheba and Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were Ashurim and Letushim and Lumimin. Again, the names. Say those names 3 times fast and see what happens. But also notice, Asher, the Asherites come from him. Letushites and Limites come directly from these descendants of Abraham and Keturah. Verse 4, the sons of Midian were Ephah and Epher, they may be twins, and Hanok and Abidah, and Eldah. All these were the sons of Keturah. Now Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. But to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts while he was still living, and sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the land of the east. So, what Abraham is doing here is he's settling all of his estate before he dies. So that there will be no question, there will be no battling amongst the family. He gives Isaac all that he has. He settles his estate with Isaac. Isaac's the son of the promise. Isaac's the one that was promised by God to Abraham and Sarah. So Isaac gets the lion's share of this. And then he gives gifts while he was still living to the sons of his concubines. So he is settling his estate all the way. Isaac being the child of the promise, being the full heir to Abraham, he gets everything. And then he gives gifts to the rest. And then he sends his sons away. He sends his sons away to the land of the east. This is east of Canaan, in the region of Arabia. So that also would explain to the Israelites that were in the wilderness wanderings why all these people are in this region. Is because Abraham sent them there. And they settled in those regions. And they had descendants. And they became nations, just as God had promised. Then verse 7 says, these are all the years of Abraham's life that he lived, 175 years. Now contrast that with the age, that is the age of all the people that had passed away in prior generations. You've got those that lived into 900s and 930s and 960s, and it was quite common. And now, by this point, Abraham has lived 175 years, and that is considered ancient. So that shows you that something had changed. Something had changed in the earth's climate. And of course, our friends in Apologetics Press, I think, have done a good job explaining possibly what was going on after the flood. The climate had changed. The atmosphere had changed. Whereas the ultraviolet rays of the sun were filtered out by the water canopy that had surrounded the earth prior to the flood. Now that was gone, and the ultraviolet rays were now affecting individuals as far as the aging process is concerned. And also there's a lot more space and a lot more time in between Adam and Eve, the first perfect genetic human pair, and now you come down to Abraham, and you've got people that are dying of diseases and different kinds of things that did not take place in earlier generations. So a lot of these factors enter in as far as the longevity of man is concerned. So he's lived to 175 years old, and verse 8 says, Abraham breathed his last and died in a ripe old age. Notice that. Moses even goes so far as to say that Abraham at 175 was a ripe old age. Now contrast that to Methuselah, 969 years. You talk about a ripe old age. That is old. But now Abraham is 175, and that's a ripe old age. That shows you that there's something that's changed as far as the atmosphere of the earth. And old man, again, Moses emphasizes this, and satisfied with life. Abraham had no regrets, or Isaac that is, or Abraham, yes. Abraham had no regrets whatsoever. He had lived a full life by any measuring stick. And he was gathered to his people. That's an interesting phrase. He was gathered to his people. There's been more than one gospel preacher and scholar among us who has suggested that this implies that there are those beyond the grave to whom Abraham was gathered. And I think they have a very good point to make on that. In other words, this is talking about not this life, he was gathered to his people, but beyond the grave. He is, of course, reunited with those that had gone on before. Interesting phrase. Then his sons Isaac and Ishmael, notice this, they come together at the death of their father. Isaac and Ishmael is reunited for, in how many years? How long has it been since they've actually seen each other? And at the death of Abraham, they come together to bury him. They buried him in the cave of Machpelah. Remember that cave that Abraham had bought for Sarah? It was a double cave. Well, now he is buried there. In the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, facing Mamre, the field which Abraham purchased from the sons of Heth. There Abraham was buried with Sarah, his wife. He wants to be buried alongside his wife Sarah in that cave, the cave of Machpelah, and Isaac and Ishmael accomplished that for him. It came about after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac. The mantle is now passed. The torch is passed from Abraham to Isaac, the son of the promise. And Isaac lived by Beer-lahai-roi. And now Moses shifts our focus temporarily away from Isaac, and since he's mentioned Ishmael, he catches us up with Ishmael himself. Verse 12. Now these are the records of the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's maid, bore to Abraham. Notice that phrase. These are the records of the generations. This is the 7th time that Moses has mentioned this phrase. There will be a total of 10 times in this book that he mentions these are the generations of. This is the 7th time he mentions it in connection with Ishmael. Verse 13. And these are the names of the sons of Ishmael by their names in the order of their birth. Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, and Kedar, we'll get back to that in a second, and Abdil, and Mibsan, and Mishma, and Duma, and Massa. Kedar, his descendants are mentioned briefly by Isaiah in Isaiah 21:17. His descendants were skilled archers. They were skilled using the bow and arrow. Interesting side note. Verse 15. Hadad and Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedema. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names by their villages and by their camps. 12 princes according to their tribes. Remember what God had promised to Hagar when she was thinking that she would die, that Ishmael would die, and she prayed to God, and God answered her. God told her that Ishmael's descendants would become princes, and they would become heads of nations. This is the fulfillment of that promise. 12 princes according to their tribes. These are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. See, Ishmael lives a good long life according to this time frame. And he breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. Again, that phrase, that interesting phrase, he was gathered to his people. They settled from Havilah to Shur, which is east of Egypt as one goes toward Assyria. He settled in defiance of all his relatives. This is North Arabia is where he's describing, where Moses is describing. And as he describes it here, it sounds almost like somebody that lives here in our state. You know, it's settled over there near Florence as you're going toward Tupelo, or as you're going down toward, in other words, you know exactly, if you lived here any length of time, you know about where he's talking about. Well, that's what Moses is doing with the Israelites. He's describing it. Havilah to Shur, which is east of Egypt, as one goes toward Assyria. Well, they know exactly where that was. And so he's getting us caught up with all of this. And now the scene shifts back over to Isaac and Rebekah. Now these are the records of the generations of Isaac. The 8th occurrence of that phrase. We saw the 7th occurrence earlier in the chapter. Now we see the 8th occurrence of the 10 right here in this verse. Abraham's son. Abraham became the father of Isaac. And Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean of Padanaram, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. My best friend from my days at Freed Hardeman did not get married until he was 40 years old. And he was waiting for the right one, and he found her. And they've since had adopted a child, and they're doing well. He's a deacon in the church up in Chattanooga, but he waited all those years before he became married. I have another friend of mine, if I call his name, you know who he is, a son of a preacher in this state, who waited a long time. In fact, his mother was worried about it. Is he ever going to find someone? And he told me himself, David said, I'm looking around at all of our classmates, and they're either, they're divorced or they've had marriage problems. And he said, I'm just terrified. He said, I'm wanting to find the right one just like my parents did. Well, he did. And he made up for lost time because he's got 2 sets of twins and 1 additional. So, it happens. 40 years old, he gets married to Rebekah. And so, Moses continues. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. And the Lord answered him. And Rebekah, his wife, conceived. So she had not been able to have children up to this point. Isaac prays, Rebekah conceives. But watch this. The children struggled together within her. They struggled. They were fighting. They were wrestling with each other in the womb. And she said, if it is so, why then am I this way? So she went in to inquire of the Lord. She wanted to seek an answer. Why is this happening? I've got these children in my womb, and it's probably keeping her up at night. She can't get much rest. She's wondering why in the world this is going on. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples will be separated from your body. And 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Notice this. 2 nations are within you. She's got twins, in other words. 2 sons. And the older, that is the older son, will serve the younger son. Now, the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans refers to this very event, this very citation. In Romans chapter 9, verses 10 through 12, it says, not only this, but there was Rebekah also, when she had conceived twins by one man, our father Isaac. For though the twins were not yet born, had not done anything good or bad, so that God's purpose according to his choice would stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls, he said to her, the older will serve the younger. He's making a point, a theological point to the brethren there in Rome from this very passage. The older will serve the younger. Neither one of these children had done anything good or bad, Paul says. They're innocent, but God called it. God declared it. The older will serve the younger. That's very significant. And it's something that both Isaac and Rebekah are going to forget, as we're going to see. When her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. That word behold is interesting in the Hebrew. It's like, behold, surprise. In other words, when they were born, whoa, twins, they're here. And so, verse 25, now the first came forth red, all over like a hairy garment. And they named him Esau. This child comes out with hair all over him. Our first son, when he was born, he had a full head of hair. I kid you not. I saw him. First time he came out, I saw him. Full head of hair. Second son, Jonathan, came out, full head of hair. Never seen anything like it. Well, y'all have, I'm sure. But still, Isaac and Rebekah give birth to Esau. His name means hairy, by the way. That's what Esau means. Later, he's going to be called Edom. Edom means red. So both those characteristics that were seen when Esau was born stick with him the rest of his life. Afterward, his brother came forth with his hand holding on to Esau's heel. Now, you talk about an unusual birth. Here comes Esau, and the other son is grabbed onto his heel. So his name was called Jacob. The name Jacob means one who takes by the heel or one who supplants. Interesting. Interesting name chosen for that son. And Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them. So Isaac wasn't a young man when this takes place. So Isaac is 60. Rebekah gives birth when she's relatively advanced in years. And they've got twins, Jacob and Esau. When the boys grew up, Moses skips several years until they get into their teens or late teens, early 20s. Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field. You can see Esau going out in the woods, hunting game. He lives out in the outdoors. He's a guy that's comfortable, camping out. He's a guy that's comfortable going out hunting for food. But Jacob was a peaceful man. He's quiet. Jacob was quiet, living in tents. Esau prefers to live outdoors. Jacob says, I prefer to live indoors. And Esau apparently by implication is boisterous, perhaps, loud. Jacob's quiet. He's peaceful. He prefers to be indoors. Now Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for game. But Rebekah loved Jacob. And this sets up the problems that we're going to see. How often do you see this take place in families? Where preference is given to one by one parent, preference is given to the other by the other parent. What was the Smothers Brothers? Remember the Smothers Brothers? Mama loved you better than me, or that kind of old joke kind of thing. Well, this is actually happening between Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac prefers Esau. Rebekah prefers Jacob. That sets up this conflict that's about to take place. And when Jacob had cooked stew, now I believe the King James says lentils. Other translations render this in different ways. Basically, it means stew, the phrase here in the Hebrew. Esau came in from the field and he was famished. So Esau's been hunting. Esau's been out in the forest or out in the wilderness, and he hadn't had a thing to eat. He's so hungry, he thinks he's going to die. Have you ever been that hungry? I just going to have something to eat. I just don't know if I can go on. Well, you can. You can go on a little longer as long as you eat something. But still Esau comes in and he's famished. And Esau said to Jacob, please let me have a swallow of that red stuff there, for I am famished. That's the way the New American Standard renders that. Please let me have a swallow of that red stuff. Interesting, the Hebrew in that particular verse, that particular phrase can be rendered several different ways. And basically what Esau was saying is, give me some of what you got. What you're cooking right there. That stuff, that red stuff. Because I'm famished. And Esau said, therefore, his name was called Edom. Edom, of course, being named red, as we've already mentioned. But Jacob said, first, sell me your birthright. Interesting. Jacob knows his brother perhaps better than his brother knows himself. They've grown up together, after all. And a brother knows if he has a brother or a sister, he knows that sibling better than anyone, just about. So Jacob says, let me have your birthright. Sell me your birthright. Now, what's the significance of this? The birthright has legal, familial, and spiritual benefits. It is highly significant. If you've got the birthright, you've got control. Jacob knows that. Esau apparently hasn't ever paid attention to that. Esau doesn't care anything about all that growing up. And so all he knows at this moment in time, I am starving, I need something to eat or I'm going to die. And so what happens? Esau said, verse 32, behold, I'm about to die, so of what use then is the birthright to me? You see, Esau had no comprehension of what he was about to do. Esau had no comprehension at this point about how important this birthright was. Watch further. And Jacob said, first, swear to me. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Jacob knows exactly what he's doing. He made Esau swear to him first. Why? Because when Esau swore to Jacob, that binds it. He can't wriggle out of it. He can't say, well, I was starving, I didn't know what I was doing, so, you forced me to do it. No. He had said already, what use is my birthright to, in this moment? And then he swears. And then he sells him his birthright. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, a bowl of beans. I've had bowls of beans before that were absolutely fantastic, of all sorts. But I have never seen a bowl of beans that's worth selling everything that I've got. And this is what Esau had. Esau had the birthright up to this point. He had control, and he sells it. And he ate and drank and rose and went on his way. Thus, Moses writes, Esau despised his birthright. Esau despised it. That is, he thought it was worth nothing. Yes, sir. He actually had it by being firstborn. Because he was the firstborn son, he had control. He had everything. In other words, he had first rights on everything that Isaac had legally. As far as the family is concerned, he would be considered, after Isaac would die, Esau would be the head of the family. He would have control. He'd have spiritual rights that attended to that because of the patriarchal system. But as far as him being aware of all of that and appreciating all of that, didn't mean anything to Esau. Esau was just interested in hunting. He was interested in going out in the woods. He was interested in all of that, but he had no interest as far as the birthright was concerned, as far as the importance is concerned, from what Moses tells us. You come down to Hebrews chapter 12, and it's interesting. This is what the Hebrews writer says about this. that there be no immoral or godless person like Esau, who sold his own birthright for a single meal. For you know that even afterwards, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected. For he found no place for repentance, though he sought for it with tears. It's too late by the time he realizes what he'd done. Too late for all that. He's already sold it. He was at this moment of time, according to the Hebrews writer says he was immoral, number one. Number two, he was godless. So that gives us an insight into the character of the man, of the young man. Esau at this point, because he was following after his own physical gratification apparently, in so many ways, he had no interest in things that are spiritual. And Jacob knew that, and Jacob, I don't want to say manipulates it, because he did everything legally, up and up. He was by the book. But he knew his brother better than his brother knew himself. Any questions or comments further before we get in chapter 26? This whole thing sets up this tragedy that's about to take place. That's going to be taking place shortly. And when we get there, we're probably not going to get there this morning, but when we get there to that famous incident of the blessing, there's nobody that comes out looking good in that whole chapter. Everybody's got the blame in some way. And it's a tragedy. It really is. Considering where Abraham was, what his stature and his spiritual status before the Lord, and where Isaac was. And Isaac, of course, for so many years, he's the promised son. He's the one that inherits everything from Abraham. And now, coming down to his progeny, we begin to see sin entering in even more. And that's what really takes place. But, chapter 26. Now there was a famine in the land, besides the previous famine that had occurred in the days of Abraham. So Isaac went to Gerar, to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. Gerar is a stopover en route to Egypt. And this Abimelech is not the same Abimelech that we saw in connection with Abraham. This is apparently a dynastic name. In other words, like Tutmos or Tutmoses was a dynastic name in Egypt. Well, this Abimelech is similar to that. It's a dynastic name. The Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Stay in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and to your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath which I swore to your father Abraham. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and will give your descendants all these lands, and by your descendants all the nations of the earth shall be blessed." So he repeats the promise to Isaac. He makes sure that Isaac knows you are inheriting the same blessings, the same promises that your father did. And then he says in verse 5, "Because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." What a compliment to Abraham. Think about this man Abraham, how much of a godly man he was, and how he lived for the Lord all of his life. He was a man just like we are. He had weaknesses just like we do, family being his main weakness, as we have seen. But it doesn't get in the way of the fact that God pronounced that Abraham obeyed him. He kept his charge, kept his commandments, kept his statutes, kept his laws. Can that be said about us? Can that be said about us by the Lord when we pass? That, fill in the blank, your name, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my laws. He, she obeyed me. That'd be a great thing for it to be said about us. So Isaac lived in Gerar. When the men of the place asked about his wife, he said, "She is my sister," for he was afraid to say my wife, thinking the men of the place might kill me on account of Rebekah, for she is beautiful. All right, here's that same old problem. That same old mistake. Apparently the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree on this. Isaac has learned this tactic from his dad. Maybe Abraham's talked about it. Maybe Abraham has done this in front of Isaac, where Isaac saw it happen or heard it. And so Isaac thinks, well, something might happen. So we'll just say you're my sister. And get this, Rebekah was still considered a beautiful woman. In this, even though they're getting on up in years, still a beautiful woman, speaks volumes about her physical appearance. It came about when he had been there a long time that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out through a window and saw, and behold, Isaac was caressing his wife Rebekah. Again, he uses that word, behold. Behold, surprise! Abimelech and all of his servants have thought, this is the sister, and he looks out, just happens to look out, and what does he see? Well, the King James Version says that Isaac was sporting with his wife. No. He wasn't playing volleyball, he wasn't playing basketball or softball or something like that, or tennis. No, he wasn't sporting. The New American Standard Version says he was caressing her. That's the word. In other words, this is not a sister. This is his wife. It was obvious. Then Abimelech called Isaac and said, behold, certainly she is your wife. How then did you say she is my sister? And Isaac said to him, because I said I might die on account of her. That same weakness is present with Isaac. Abimelech said, what is this you have done to us? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us. Like Abraham, Isaac receives a stinging rebuke from the man in charge. So Abimelech charged all the people, saying, he who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. In other words, you don't touch her. She's got the protection of the throne as well as protection of Isaac as far as he can. Now Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. And the Lord blessed him. And the man became rich and continued to grow richer until he became very wealthy. And in this sense, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. Abraham was a humongously wealthy individual. And Isaac inherited that same knack from his father. He becomes wealthy in himself. For he had possessions of flocks and herds and a great household, so that the Philistines envied him. That's how much he had expanded. Apparently, Isaac was a firm believer in free enterprise, because that's the way he was able to get rich easily. Now all the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father, the Philistines stopped up by filling them with earth. Then Abimelech said to Isaac, go away from us, for you are too powerful for us. Now that's a commentary. Abimelech recognizes that Isaac has grown his possessions, his servants, his soldiers, to the point where they were a threat to the Philistines. And Isaac departed from there and camped in the valley of Gerar, and settled there. Then Isaac dug again the wells of water which had been dug in the days of his father Abraham. For the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham, and he gave them the same names which his father had given them. So he goes and redigs all of the wells that his father had dug. But when Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found there a well of flowing water, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with the herdsmen of Isaac, saying, the water is ours. So he named the well Esek, because they contended with him. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over it too. So he named it Sitnah. He moved away from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he named it Rehoboth. For he said, at last the Lord has made room for us, and we will be fruitful in the land. So he goes from well to well and digs, and they stop it up. And he finally finds one where they don't affect it. And that's where he settles in. Then he went up from there to Beersheba. The Lord appeared to him the same night and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham. He again repeats that promise to Isaac. So he built an altar there and called upon the name of the Lord. So he worships and pitched his tent there. And there Isaac's servants dug a well. So finally he's able to settle. Finally he's able to get into a place where it's not challenged. Then Abimelech came to him from Gerar with his advisor Ahuzeth and Phicol, the commander of his army. That word, that name Phicol, is a title. It's a title for commander-in-chief. This is commander-in-chief of his military. Isaac said to them, "Why have you come to me since you hate me and have sent me away from you?" They said, "We see plainly that the Lord has been with you." That's a shock. Abimelech acknowledging that. The Lord has been with you. So we said, "Let there now be an oath between us, even between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you." Now this covenant is not a spiritual covenant. In this context, this covenant is a treaty. We want to make a treaty. We want to make some kind of an agreement with you. They see how powerful he's become, and they want to make an agreement. That you will do us no harm, just as we have not touched you and have done to you nothing but good and have sent you away in peace. You are now the blessed of the Lord. This, in essence, is a non-aggression pact. You don't attack us, we won't attack you. If we make this agreement, there's not going to be any kind of strife, any kind of war that happens between us. Then he made them a feast, and they ate and drank. In this context, this feast is a covenant meal. This is a meal that's going to acknowledge this agreement between the two parties. In the morning, they arose early and exchanged oaths. Then Isaac sent them away, and they departed from him in peace. So they had the covenant meal the night before. Early in the morning, they wake up, and they make the covenant. Formally bind the covenant by making oaths with each other. This is how it went in the ancient Near East. This is the way that different warring tribes or potentially warring tribes would settle their differences. Now it came about on the same day that Isaac's servants came in and told him about the well which they had dug, and said to him, "We have found water." So he called it Sheba. Therefore the name of the city is Beer-sheba to this day. This is not the last time you're going to see this name mentioned in the Old Testament. Beersheba. From Dan to Beersheba, we're told, from the north to the south. Beersheba is the extreme southern part of the land of Canaan. When Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, the daughter of Beri the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. This indicates to us at this point that when Esau was 40, he still had no concern whatsoever for anything spiritual. He'd gone all these years without concern, and it just continues. And notice what Moses says in a way of commentary. And they, that is Esau's wives, brought grief to Isaac and Rebekah. Another rendering of that brought grief would be brought a bitterness of spirit. A bitterness of spirit to Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac and Rebekah worried about Esau continually. And it was because, or in a large part, because of these wives that he had married. These Hittite wives, these Hittite women who cared nothing at all for Jehovah. Abraham knew that. That's the reason why Abraham sent all the way back over to Ur the Chaldees to pick the wife for Isaac. Isaac didn't make that kind of decision for his son. Esau just chose whoever he wanted. And these women, these Hittite women, contributed greatly to this bitterness that existed with Isaac and Rebekah. And as we're going to see, sets the stage with everything else that we've seen for what we're going to see next week in the next chapter. Chapter 27, the well-known story about the blessing that Esau expected to get and Jacob got it instead. Well, nobody wins in this thing. There's no party in this family tragedy that's free from fault. It's just a tragedy all the way around. But it works out for the good of all concerned spiritually, as we also will see. So that's where we'll take our study.